That helps bring down interest rates in the global market for dollars. And meanwhile, we're not lending to those banks, we're lending to the central bank. The central bank is responsible for repaying us.
So who got the money?
To financial institutions in Europe and other countries.
Which ones?
I don't know.
$500 billion and you don't know who got the money?
The loan went to the loans go to the central banks, and they then put them out to their institutions to try to bring down short-term interest rates in dollar markets around the world.
Well, let's start with which central banks got the money.
There are 14 of them which are listed in our, I'm sure they're listed in here somewhere.
All right, so who actually made that decision to hand out $1 trillion that way, $500 billion? Who made that decision?
The Federal Open Market Committee.
Okay, and was it done at one time or in a series of meetings?
A series of meetings.
And under what legal authority?
We have a long-standing legal authority to do swaps with other central banks.
Do you
It's not an emergency authority of any kind.
Anything specific about it?
Do you know my counsel says Section 14 of the Federal Reserve Act.
All right, we actually looked at one of the arrangements, and one of the arrangements is $9 billion for New Zealand. That works out to $3,000 for every single person who lives in New Zealand. Seriously, wouldn't it have been better to extend that kind of credit to Americans rather than New Zealanders?
It's not costing Americans anything. We're getting interest back and it comes back. It's not at the cost of any American credit. We are extending credit to Americans.
Well, wouldn't it necessarily affect the credit markets if you extend $500 billion in credit to anybody?
We are lending to all U.S. Financial institutions in exactly the same way.
Well, look at the next page. The very next page has the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate, which shows a 20% increase in the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate at exactly the same time that you were handing out $500 billion. Do you think that's a coincidence?
Yes.
All right, well, the Constitution says, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law.
This money is not drawn from the Treasury.
Well, let's talk about that. Do you think it's consistent with the spirit of that provision in the Constitution for a group like the FMOC to hand out $500 billion to foreigners without any action by this Congress?
Congress approved it in the Federal Reserve Act.
When was that?
Quite a long time ago. I don't know the exact date.
100 years ago?
The original act is 1914, I believe.
I don't know whether this provision was in 1914 or not, but the Federal Reserve Act was in 1913.
All right, and at that time, the entire gross national product of this country was well under $500 billion, wasn't it?
I don't know.
Is it safe to say that nobody in 1913 contemplated that your small little group of people would decide to hand out $500 billion to foreigners?
This particular authority has been used numerous times over the years.
Well, actually, according to the chart on page 28, virtually the entire amount that's reflected in your current balance sheet went out starting in the last quarter of 2007. And before that, going back to the beginning of this chart, the amount of lending was zero to foreigners.
It was zero before the crisis, yeah. But this was part of the process, working with other central banks to, again, to try to get dollar money markets working normally in the global economy.
All right, my time is very limited.
The gentleman's time is expired. The gentleman
Thank
from
you,
New York.
Mr. Chairman.
If you take out that $1 bill that's in your wallet or purse and look at the front left side where that dark green circle emblem is at with the letter F in the center, you will read the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a privately owned bank that complies with no laws, no taxes, no audits, no boundaries, and is to never be held accountable for the fraudulent super scheme interest that is enforced upon the masses with the taxes that are deducted from our paychecks. If you are asking yourself, what does this fact have anything to do with the war that's going on right now? Let's just connect the dots in a simple approach here. All forms of currency, whether it be a penny, quarter, or the American dollar, are all created out of thin air. Then the United States government, who is in need of money, comes in and says to the Federal Reserve, we need $6 billion or more. Can you give us this loan? The Federal Reserve comes in and says, sure, no problem, but just make sure to pay us back every penny with the interest that's included. The government agrees on this deal, and then the Federal Reserve makes the money out of thin air, only physically existing in a digital banking system, and then gives the government what's called a bond, which is basically a worthless piece of paper. Consider it to be like an IOU note. Now that the government has this loan, large portions of this money is then distributed to all major corporations, companies, and bank institutions. This is the part where we the people come in. We look for a job, get hired, work the 9 to 5, day after day, with no peace of mind, collect our paycheck, cash it in, and then get whatever's left in the taxes that were incurred and taken out from our restless hard work and life-consuming labor. These taxes are then paid back to the fraudulent companies check after check, then sustained for a period of time until the governments have reached the amount of money to pay back what was loaned by the Federal Reserve, but with interest. Now that you have come to this point, you might want to ask yourself, why are you even paying taxes in the first place? I mean, have you ever honestly asked yourself that question? The answer is simple. To control and limit the annual income of the middle class, enslaving society with the remnants of all the tax dollars that we are forced to pay, while the richest families and bankers in the world sleep in $1,000 bed sheets inside multi-million-dollar mansions, while the rest of humanity is left with the crumbs living inside these compressed compact boxes we call a house. The legality of this problem was not by mere chance or accidental, but by design. The money that is taken out from your paycheck is not for the sake of your well-being, financial contribution to your state, Social Security, or anything for that matter. The biggest scam of corporate America all the way back to the 1900s is the unconstitutional, illegal, and criminal implementation to pay your income taxes. There is absolutely no statute, no rule, no policy, no regulation, no document, and no law in existence whatsoever in the books of anything that requires you to pay taxes for your work and labor.
I really expected that, of course there's a law that you can point to in the law book, the code that requires you to file a tax return. Of course there is. Maybe I don't know what it is right then as he was speaking to me, but sure. So naively, I agreed to go off and research it and get back to him. 3.5 months later, I was at that point where I couldn't find the statute that clearly made a person liable, at least not me and most people I know, and I had no choice in my mind except to resign.
There is a substantial, conclusive body of evidence that proves that our income tax system represents the most pernicious form of tyranny. It is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated by government against the working men and women of America.
American citizens, along with the foundation, have been asking the IRS to specifically provide them with the underlying legal foundation upon which they administer and enforce the personal income tax laws in our country.
A lot of people might say, well, gee, if there wasn't an income tax, what would happen to education? They don't understand that education is paid for the most part, out of state and local taxes, your property tax. People might say, well, how are we going to build and maintain our highways if there's no money coming in to the government? We need our highways. There is a tax on every gallon of gasoline that people buy. Proceeds from the income tax do not pay for highway construction. The amount of money that we spend on defense is exactly equal to the amount of corporate income tax.
I think we should not want the income tax for several reasons. One is that it is the instrument of totalitarianism. It is the means by which the government can manipulate people.
The federal government itself refuses to provide the American people who are coercively being subjected to this extraction of their private property without any underlying legal justification. There is no law that requires the average American worker in the private sector to pay a direct unapportioned tax on their labor and compensation for services. There is no law.
We, the People Foundation for Constitutional Education, put a full-page ad in the USA Today on July 7, 2000,